In section 3, we'll deal with cardiac and renal pharmacology. This is a section, again, that is extremely important, and it'll come perfectly fine after the autonomic nervous system. You'll see there will hardly be a single chapter in this section where we do not use what we've learned out of the autonomic nervous system section. Many of the drugs you've seen in the previous section actually will be an integral part of treating such diseases as hypertension, heart attacks, angina, and so forth. But first, to me really, I think overall one of the toughest chapters you're going to encounter in here will be the chapter of antiarrhythmics. So it's easier to start with what is going to cause us some trouble. And just in case, we're going to review some of the fundamental concepts that you surely have seen with physiology. We're just going to tweak them a little bit with pharmacology in mind. First, since antiarrhythmics are going to be working with electrical activity, we need to review the action potentials. So if you look at your screen, you recognize here the action potential of a fast response fiber. One of the first points you should be aware of is the fact that the resting membrane potential on these cells is extremely negative, minus 90 millivolt. That very negative membrane potential will make that cell less likely to have abnormal automaticity. Being farther away from its threshold potential, it should not start firing by itself. At the same time, I'll show you in a later slide that being at minus 90 millivolt also makes them very ready to fire, so that as soon as nodal tissue will tell your atrial muscle or ventricular muscle to get going, then surely right away everything in sync will be able to have electrical activity and start firing. So we start at minus 90 millivolt. I'm sure if I ask you what is the first current, you probably are all telling me that it's going to be the fast sodium current. That fast sodium current is called this way because if you check this arrow, it starts abruptly and just very quickly finishes. Sodium is an ion for which the net force, remember, is the combination of concentration and electrical force. This is an ion for which the net force is to push it into the cell. And as the positive charges of sodium get into that cell, you expect a rapid depolarization. This depolarization is called phase 0, and you would expect that the class of antiarrhythmic that is said to block voltage-dependent sodium channel should actually be interacting with this phase 0. Following that phase 0, a slight overshoot into a positive membrane potential territory is referred to as phase 1. It is thought that the positive inside the cell actually attracts a little bit of chloride, and that is why you get that little peak. None of the drugs we will work with will have anything to do with that overshoot. Rather, we then like to see that plateau phase carried out by calcium ion, and as calcium comes in to depolarize, you know that during this phase 2, potassium is also leaving the cell. So for a period of many milliseconds, you will have what we call the plateau phase of this action potential. This plateau phase will eventually stop as phase 3. The repolarization associated with potassium exit brings that cell back to around minus 90 millivolts. Well, when you look at this, then you can imagine clearly that interfering with an action potential offers us the possibility of using at the very least 3 classes of drug. The ones that would work on that fast sodium current, the one that would work on the slow calcium current, and certainly the ones that will work on that delayed rectifier potassium current. All along this action potential, you may want to remember also that sodium-potassium ATPase plays a great role at trying to reinstate the proper ionic gradient. Now that sodium is filling inside the cell and potassium is leaving, someone has to work using ATP to bring the ionic gradients back to normal, so that as you see to the far right of your diagram, eventually you'll be able to start a new action potential. Now we'll talk more about those voltage-dependent channels in a second, but I have to break bad news for you. There's one current that we don't see in physiology, and it'll be important for us in pharmacology. You see this plateau phase, that phase 2? It seems, according to the physiologists, that only calcium entering and potassium leaving play a role at this level. Well, really, sodium still plays a role here too. The only thing is that it cannot be through the fast sodium current. In a way, you would imagine that sodium started at the beginning of phase 0, right where I'm putting the big red dot, and it won't start again until the next big red dot. So, you know, this is what we call a window. And during this window, what we can measure is sodium entry, particularly during the plateau phase. So if you want, on your notes, do yourself a favor and decide that during the plateau phase there is also increased sodium. And that increased sodium is going to happen through what we call slow sodium window channels. These window channels, you'll see they'll come and plague us when we work with class 1B antiarrhythmic. But enough for right now on fast response fiber. You now have a good idea as to which currents are going to be played on with drugs. The other action potential is the one that we call the slow response fiber. And the slow response fiber is something that we would associate primarily with nodal tissue, particularly SA and AV nodal cells. Those slow response fiber, the first thing I want you to check out is on the y-axis. Notice the resting membrane potential. This resting membrane potential, as you can see, is certainly not minus 90 millivolt, is it? You can see right here, it's around minus 70. And around minus 70 millivolt, the issue will be that you're already very close to threshold, meaning this is a tissue that potentially will be able to fire action potential by itself, have that property of automaticity. There's also another story behind that minus 70 millivolt. If you are partially depolarized, well, the voltage-dependent sodium channels will be in their inactivated states and will not be participating in the action potential of slow response fiber. That is why pretty much the only thing that is responsible for the upstroke of this action potential will be the slow calcium current, allowing, of course, the calcium to get in and, as usual, to repolarize the delayed rectifier potassium current is going to be what does the job. So notice the absence of sodium here. And the absence of sodium current, well, should tell you one thing about our drugs we'll call sodium channel blockers. Do you think they're going to have any effect on the cardiac action potential of nodes? I'm hoping you're saying no. There's no participation of sodium in this action potential, so the class 1 drug, the sodium channel blockers, will only work on the fast response fibers. As to the pacemaker current, these cells are unique for having a pacemaker current activity. Pacemaker current, for the longest time, eluded physiologists. They used to call it the funny current. Maybe you remember it used to be called IF, F for funny. So I don't know what was so funny about it, when you have an exam to take about it. But when you look at it, it's a complex current that involves sodium, calcium, and potassium. The key point for us is that this pacemaker current not only is the reason why we'll see automaticity in these cells, it's also where your autonomic nervous system is going to play its biggest role. So let me show you this. I'm going to take a little file, and what you will do with me is basically decide that you're going to take some notes. We're going to remind ourselves some points actually all the way back to the general principles. Here is a nodal cell. I'm sure you recognize a nodal cell. It looks exactly like this. No, I'm just kidding you. And as you look at this nodal cell right here, let's put a receptor. I'm going to put a beta-1 receptor on this cell. Do you remember how they work? Are you thinking G protein couple? And are you thinking GS couple? If you're not, slap yourself a little bit, not too hard. And here's your G protein coupled receptor with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 transmembrane domain. Remember how your boards like to show them as a little snake. And as a G protein coupled receptor that we call a beta-1 receptor, it's the one that responds to norepinephrine, therefore to the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. And if it's coupled to a GS protein, then remember that GS protein stimulate which enzyme? Yes, adenyl cyclase. And stimulating adenyl cyclase, this GS is going to allow ATP to make cyclic AMP. Let's not forget that cyclic AMP in turn stimulates protein kinase A. And protein kinase A, as we know, will phosphorylate substrates in order to either turn it on or turn it off. Well, here the substrates for once is not going to be an enzyme. Let me take a little eraser and make a few ion channels, if you want to do the same on your page, and make yourself 3 ion channels. These ion channels, imagine one of them might be an ion channel to sodium, another one might be one to potassium, and another one maybe to calcium. The whole idea is overall there are three major ions that we pass through channels: sodium, potassium, and calcium. And sometimes we get confused in medicine thinking, oh, there's one sodium channel or two sodium channel. Would you believe that the reality is that there might be upwards of 30 different subtypes of these channels? They're all different proteins that respond to different conditions, but they all share something in common. They have a pore that lets sodium, potassium, or calcium get in. So don't always think that if I say a drug works on a sodium channel, don't always think that if I say a drug always works on a sodium channel, it's always working on the voltage-dependent fast sodium channel. It might be other channels altogether. Now here, beta-1 was stimulated by norepinephrine. GS stimulated the production of cyclic AMP. What would be the status of all these channels that are cyclic AMP dependent? Phosphorylated or dephosphorylated? If pKa was activated, I'm sure you're telling me phosphorylated. If you're not, we're in trouble. A phosphatase would have dephosphorylated them. pKa will phosphorylate them. Now you need to put the two things together, which is phosphorylation going to open or close the channel? When I know that beta-1 receptors are supposed to increase the heart rate. If you want to increase the heart rate, would you like this cell to be depolarized, or would you like this cell to be hyperpolarized? Depolarized, of course, closer to threshold, ready to fire, in which case phosphorylation of a sodium channel surely opens that channel so that sodium can come into the cell, and as it comes in, starts depolarizing that tissue. You know, for calcium, it's the same story. Phosphorylated calcium channel under these conditions will be open and allow more calcium to be inside that cell, further depolarizing that cell, making sure that it is at threshold and ready to fire the voltage-dependent action potential. How about for potassium channel? You remember that potassium leaves cells, and if it leaves cells, phosphorylation of a potassium channel to be associated with depolarization must close this channel, so that then potassium stays in. And if potassium stays in together with sodium and calcium influx, you know that cell will be depolarized. As such, here's your action potential from the diagram. Now imagine I went all the way back down to resting membrane potential. What should happen to the slope of that pacemaker current? If I put an average slope here, I'm hoping you're thinking that a beta-1 receptor is going to steepen that slope and make you reach threshold sooner, so that like this you'll start firing your next action potential sooner than usual. You'll speed up your heart rate. Now that's what the pacemaker current is all about, being associated with sodium, potassium and calcium conductance, so that like this we can modify that pacemaker current slope. If beta-1 stimulates the heart rate by opening sodium, calcium channels and closing potassium, what would you think a muscarinic M2 receptor would do? Anyone remembers M2 receptors and their coupling? Well, M2 receptors are GI coupled. And if they are GI coupled, you know they would inhibit adenyl cyclase and lower that cyclic AMP. If they do, now we can mess up the diagram royally. You can imagine with GI coupling, we would see dephosphorylation, and that dephosphorylation would now close sodium and calcium and open potassium channels. If you open potassium channel, then potassium leaves. And if potassium leaves with muscarinic M2 stimulation, then you know the cell is now hyperpolarized. So on your diagram, you would now expect your pacemaker current to have a lighter slope. And with a lighter slope, it's going to reach the threshold later. So here on your far right diagram, you see the effect of beta-1 and its tachycardia, increasing the pacemaker activity. On the right of the diagram, in the purple slope, you see the effect of muscarinic M2. And that muscarinic M2 is causing a bradycardia. Hey, you see well the ANS regulation of SA and AV node here at the molecular level. Remember that your step 1 is always fond of the molecular activity of drugs. Here is something that they would often ask you about drugs. What do they do to cyclic AMP? What is the result at the level of currents? There's no better place to understand that balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic in the heart, but here with the SA and AV node. it also tells you something that I'm sure some of you are going to be very sad about as I'm going back to the classic slides here. Do you think it means that besides working on voltage-dependent channels with antiarrhythmic, ANS drugs will also be part of antiarrhythmics? Yeah, I'm sure some of you are crying already, but you know they would be. And particularly if I want to slow down the heart, I would have two possibilities. That of muscarinic agonist, with efficacy, you remember all the side effects we would get, or that of beta blockade, and with beta blockade and no efficacy, you know these drugs would be better tolerated, and as such, beta blockers will definitely be part also of our antiarrhythmics. Well, let's look at another big story. What will I call antiarrhythmic in pharmacology? Conventionally, we like to call antiarrhythmic drugs that slow the heart rhythm. And if you want to slow the heart rhythm, basically you want these voltage-dependent action potentials not to occur as readily. And let me show you something else also that I want you to know of before we start drugs. You know, by definition, we're going to decide that an antiarrhythmic is really a drug that slows down the heart rhythm. And quite neatly, if you remember in physiology, during an action potential, it is impossible to start another one. And if it's impossible to start another one, then the idea would be, if I want to slow down electrical activity in the heart, how about lengthening this action potential? So literally, you look at this tracing and you imagine this tracing getting spread out overall. Spread out simply by working on these ionic channels and trying to decrease the conductance of these channels. So look at this diagram. You have in blue here the action potential duration. And this action potential literally started from the moment of crossing threshold until ultimately you've regained back your resting membrane potential. You even have a relative period called RRP here on your diagram, during which a physiologist would tell you if you give a stronger than normal stimulus, you might elicit a new action potential. But as far as we're concerned, during the action potential itself, the cell is effectively refractory, ERP for effective refractory period. I will explain this to you in our last diagram of this chapter. All I want to show you right now is that obviously if I was to increase the action potential duration, then in turn it should increase the effective refractoriness of that tissue. You know, basically what I want is to do this. Let me get back to a little sheet there, as usual. This is what I want. I want this tracing to literally become like this. I'm exaggerating, of course, but you would see here that by spreading out, I would have an increased refractoriness. You know, if you understand this, which is pretty straightforward, I'm sure, for all of us, well, then you understand well the board question that will ask you to match a drug with what it does to the shape of that action potential based on its mechanism of action. So it'll be a little game that we're going to carry out in our notes afterwards.